Kelly Wedlake is our next speaker. She attended Loras College and graduated with a BA in history and secondary education from there, and then more recently attended DePaul University and graduated with her MA in history. She's worked for prospective charter schools for the last 7 years as a history teacher there. She's currently leading the Curriculum Exploration Committee, and has been made a grade level lead for 4 years. Her classroom focuses on using primary sources for instruction and simulations for hands-on learning. She's going to be talking with us today about finding the truth in truth, anti-woman and questions of authority in Sojourner Truth's work. So I'm going to leave the floor to Kelly and just ask that everybody remain muted.
Give me 1 second. My screen is all glitchy and not showing everybody supposed to be. So I'm just trying to, okay, that seems to have fixed it. Give me 1 second. Also, I'm gonna drop in the chat right now a link to a handout that I'm gonna reference. My paper I wrote about Sojourner Truth and these 2 different versions of her really famous text. And the link that I just put in the chat will take you guys to a version where you can see them side by side. It might be helpful to have open while I'm talking. Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, just checking. Zoom disappeared, but I wanted to check. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you guys about Sojourner Truth and her speech, Ain't I a Woman? We're going to kind of touch on the questions of authority and like who wrote the words and why they wrote them. So Sojourner Truth continues to be remembered as what the modern world would call an early feminist fighter. In her time, she was an abolitionist and a suffragette. Women notably went and placed their I voted women stickers on their gravesite during the 2016 election with the first major female candidate running. She's quoted frequently by female politicians and is often referenced as a touchstone for many American women's understanding of what it means to be a feminist. What is unclear is if Truth would have described herself in such terms. She is in many ways a mystery. She was illiterate, so she never learned to formally read or write, yet she has an autobiography attributed to her. She's perhaps most famous for giving a speech that is not recorded in its original form. It's the Ain't I a Woman or the Aren't I a Woman speech is arguably her most famous text. It's been included in almost every major American source book as an important historical document, not just of the fight for women's rights, but also the fight for the abolition of slavery. What's interesting about this is that there is no original text written by Truth. There are 2 versions of the speech that are most commonly used. One published in 1851 in the Anti-Slavery Bugle, almost immediately after Truth delivered it at the Akron, Ohio Women's Rights Convention. The second is a version that was printed in 1863 in the New York Independent. Neither version was penned by Truth, and both visions are simply hopeful retellings of her work. Truth did not have a written record of her speech because it was given extemporaneously. Historians need to rely on the 2 versions of her speech written by other people, and to best reach our students in particular, it's really important for us to use both texts in concert together to understand her 2-pronged activism as a suffragist and an abolitionist. So Sojourner Truth was a slave in New York. She's a complex historical figure for a lot of reasons. One of them was that she was a Northern slave. So she is an important character in our history, but she's difficult to understand because she has works that she wrote but did not actually write. She needed other people to assist her. As the quote on the screen says, it's from John Ernest. Truth herself never wrote a word. One can note, of course, that the narrative, her autobiography, was written and edited by those close to her, which is largely how we have approached Truth, at least when we have dealt with mediating circumstances. Sojourner Truth, is a story that we've kind of heard over and over again, particularly when we look at the 1863 version of the text, which adds a slave narrative to her words. The story of Truth is just a story. It was created for public consumption. A few different authors note that her narrative was sold at all of her public appearances. and it provided her means of support. Truth agreed to its publication. Truth agreed to the words that they said that they were writing for her. Her illiteracy, though, makes it impossible for her to give fully informed consent to the language used in the book or others accounting for her words. This highlights the challenge of finding the actual woman, and her belief lies behind the transcribed and remembered versions of her words. In some ways, then, the debate around these different versions of her speech given in Akron, Ohio in 1851 center on determining Sojourner Truth's agency in controlling her own narrative. The first version of Sojourner Truth's remarks at the Akron, Ohio Women's Rights Convention was published on June 21st, 1851. The report was completed by Marius Robinson and published in the Anti-Slavery Bugle. Marius Robinson was a friend of Truth, and many historians cite this friendship between Robinson and Truth as a reason for its historical authenticity and for using this version of her remarks over the version published later in 1863. Advocates for this approach believe that because of the relationship between the two, Truth had approval over the printing of these remarks. Truth begins her remarks that are reported from 1851 by boldly stating, "I am a woman's rights." She argues in this text that women should have the right to vote, not as, and she doesn't really differentiate between being a Black woman or a white woman and whether either of those groups should have the right to vote. She uses physical labor as a reason for equality between men and women. She talks about saying, "I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now." She clearly declares that she views herself as equal to men in her strength and in her ability to perform physical tasks. In the second section of the 1851 text is her discussion about intellect, and she kind of is fighting through the idea that women are not intelligent enough to have the right to vote. So she has this quote that I find to be very, very interesting. As for intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold. The poor men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have women's rights, give it to her and you will feel better. You'll have your own rights and there won't be so much trouble. So Truth is challenging the belief that men are inherently more intelligent than women, pointing out that if men believe this to be true, they should not be afraid of women filling their already smaller cups. She points this out that the men appear to be confused, and in her use of rhetoric, she turns the tables on those who claim that women are less intelligent. By pointing out that the men's fear of women becoming smarter than them, Truth bulldozes their view that women are not intelligent or educated enough to have the right to vote. Most interestingly, Truth's illiteracy would probably have been cited as a reason why she would not be given the right to vote. Yet she's a compelling narrator to demonstrate that she is just as capable as her male counterparts. She was really widely regarded as one of the best speakers at the convention, and she usually turned up at conventions like this. She uses her rhetoric to kind of point out the fallacies in this argument that men often use. She uses the quote, "I can't read, but I can hear," to also like call her own self out about her illiteracy and point out that she is still capable of being part of the conversation and having an opinion. The third section, kind of the last section of her text, is riddled with biblical references. She mentions Eve, Lazarus, Mary and Martha, and Jesus, and I want to specifically zoom in on the part about Eve. She says Eve is known for causing man to sin, but then also says if a woman upset the world, you have to give her a chance to set it right side up again. She uses a biblical reference to the original sin to point to an understanding of where many believed female inequality began, and this suggests that Truth understood where many of her listeners were first taught about the differences between men and women, particularly in the North where like Protestantism was pretty normalized at that point. Interestingly, she also says, "I can read, but I can't hear." She's illiterate. She still is able to know these stories and use them. She demonstrates in this section with the religious undertones and examples that the Christian faith is calling on followers to do good works and to work together. And she points out the need for men and women to work together based on these beliefs, and that Americans need to be doing just that. Modern historians often point to the 1851 version as the true one. It was reported only weeks after the remarks were given, and the author had been in the room when Truth spoke. How closely even this version reflects what Truth actually said remains debatable. Did Robinson clean up Truth's language to make it more palatable for a white audience? Did Robinson remove or change any of Truth's ideas? And finally, did Truth endorse this version of her remarks? These questions cannot be definitively answered. This version of the text references a suffragette message more than an abolitionist one, and this is likely because of the venue at which it was given, a women's rights convention. By playing up the suffragette message and playing down the abolition message, the 1851 version of Truth's remarks is more focused on American rights and civil liberties, not on the centuries-long debate on slavery. The second version of Truth's remarks is similar in message, but distinctly different in tone. It was published on April 23, 1863 by Frances Dana Gage. It has similar themes to those in the first reported version, but adds an anti-slavery narrative based on false facts about Truth's actual life. This is the version that you've probably read before. It's most commonly reprinted in source books. It's kept in the Library of Congress. It's often quoted in modern feminist discourse. This version, printed in the New York Independent, contains the famous "Ain't I a woman" phrase. The most drastic linguistic differences can be seen in the use of dialect in the reporting. The shift in dialect reflects the narrative of a former Southern slave, yet Sojourner Truth lived in New York for most of her time in America. Interestingly, Gage would probably also have been in attendance at the Akron event during which Truth originally gave her remarks. She was serving as president of the Women's Rights Convention of the time. In Gage's version, Truth uses a Southern dialect and spelling throughout. For the purposes of this paper, I did remove the dialect effect, and the text is cited as it's printed in her autobiography. Particularly when working with students, I think that that can help them access the text a little bit more and not get stuck kind of digging through the weeds there of that portion. So she does not start with her "I am a women's rights." Instead, she starts by acknowledging the trying times. She says, "Well, children, while there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talk about?" So she's acknowledging that the state of America at the time is very much in flux, and that's helping set the stage for both her listeners and her readers to be ready to acknowledge the unrest and how that impacts her statements that are to come. The original text ends with the warning time that times are changing, but the 1863 text begins with an acknowledgement of it. This is likely an editorial decision that Gage made as an author in 1863, living through the Civil War and as a staunch abolitionist herself. In this version of the text, Truth goes on to discuss the ways in which men and women are similar and different physically, much as she does in the 1851 version. The difference in the 1863 text lies in her explicit acknowledgement of the racial implications of these differences. Truth appears to be explicitly recognizing and speaking to the differences in the ways white and Black women were treated in America during this time. When discussing the ways that men say women need to be helped into carriages and lift over ditches, Truth replies, "Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place," before starting the repeated phrase that speech is most famous for, "And ain't I a woman?" In this specific way, Truth is thus delineating herself from the audience and the other male speakers in attendance as a woman, but also immediately bringing her race into the discussion as well. This is the crux of the main difference between the printed versions of this speech: Truth's acknowledgement of her race, as well as her specific place in life as a Black woman. The next section of the text is almost identical to the 1851 text regarding her physical ability as a woman, but it adds the slave narrative. It's likely that Gage added this version to make it more appealing to the abolitionist argument. It's hard to kind of wade through because it seems to be a narrative of an African American woman who lived in slavery in the South. This narrative is widely regarded as untrue. Truth spent most of her life in New York and was a slave in New York. She did run away from her master, but only after he reneged on his promise to grant her her freedom. The inclusion of the phrase bear the lash is a charged decision on Gage's part. It brings a physical survival of an assault into the conversation when before it was merely discussion of physical prowess or aptitude in the 1851 version of Truth's remarks. Additionally, Gage claims that Truth mentions having 13 children of her own, most of whom were sold into slavery. In fact, Truth had 5 children, and it is believed that only one was enslaved before Truth brought his freedom. While she surely cried out with a mother's grief during the ordeal, Truth probably did not have the experience of many Southern slaves who watched their family members be sold without warning. The inclusion of this narrative points to a point of view that is more centered in the discussions of 1863 than 1851. 1863 was the height of the Civil War, and the Union Army was fighting a mostly losing battle with the South over a debate that on paper was about states' rights, but in actuality was about slavery. Following this edition of the slave narrative, Truth's remarks as reported in Gage's version remain largely the same thematically to the 1851 text. Gage reports that Truth discusses intellect and again uses the pint and quart metaphor. This time there's the phrase, "What's that got to do with version of her remarks? Gone is the "you need not be afraid," replaced instead with, "If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full?" This change, robs Truth of some of her bite and agency that the first text reports. This version of Truth is not challenging the idea that male and female intellect is different, but instead pointing out that in not allowing women to fill their already smaller cup is, quote, mean. By placing emotion into the equation, Truth makes the discussion decidedly more feminine than the 1851 version of her remarks does. The 1863 version states that these women together ought to be able to turn it back and give it right side up, and now they're asking to do it, the men better let them. In this version then, Truth appears to see the need for women to work together to achieve the goal. That community-oriented message is decidedly missing from the 1851 version of her remarks. The 1863 version of the text also ends with an acknowledgement of gratitude from Truth for allowing her to speak, something missing from the Robinson report. It is unclear if this is an addition or not, as it is likely that Truth would have thanked listeners regardless of whether it is acknowledged or not. The 1863 version of Truth's remarks, as reported by Gage, a known abolitionist, is then more useful for a reader seeking to see Truth as an abolitionist than as a woman fighting for suffrage. This version of the text lends itself more to a discussion about specifically African-American female rights, not just female rights. In concert with the 1851 version of Truth's remarks, a fully formed picture emerges for the reader or the student. With both versions in conversation with one another, new opportunities open up to examine the ways in which Truth uses rhetorical practices, as well as metaphor and symbols to draw her listeners in. The similarities give the reader some fairly concrete ideas of the words spoken that day in Ohio. The differences point readers down a road that asks them to critically examine the way that we remember our heroes and opens up opportunities for discussion about the importance of examining an author's point of view and purpose. When used together, both sources present exciting avenues for discussion, particularly in classrooms examining both the fight for women's suffrage and the fight for the abolition of slavery. To get a full picture of Sojourner Truth as not just a character in American history, but as an agent of change, the 1851 text and the 1863 text needs to be used in tandem. The use of both texts with the knowledge that each leans into either Truth as an abolitionist or Truth as a suffragette allows historians to render a fuller picture of Truth. The big thing is that there's no way to know which text is most accurate, and acknowledging that to students in particular allows us to have discussions about authorial point of view as well as her participation in that point of view. By using both texts, we are able to see her as an abolitionist as well as a suffragette, and that is particularly helpful for students in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.